Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the population structure with an emphasis on how marine mammals and their populations are structured. We'll first look at population growth models before turning to something called life history traits and how those life history traits may affect conservation policies. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start by looking at how populations can increase in time. So if we take a look at this slide here, we notice that all populations have the capacity to increase each generation. I'm going to use a simple bacterium, which actually has the ability to divide every 20 minutes. If we look at one bacterium, and it divides into two, the second generation therefore has 2 individuals. Beyond that, the third generation is going to have 4 individuals because each individual in the second generation can divide and produce 2 more. So then it follows that by the 4th generation, you actually have 8 individuals. And of course, if you were to continue this model down, you would say by the 5th generation, we would have 16, by the 6th generation, we would have 32, etc. When we plot this, we actually notice something really interesting. So if we plot, the first generation has 1 data point, the second generation has 2 individuals, the third generation is going to have 4, the 4th generation is going to have 8, and the 5th generation is going to have 16, we noticed a distinct trend in how the population grows. The population grows exponentially. This is called the exponential growth model, and it is a standard modeling technique for population growth, which basically says the population has a capacity to increase each generation, often at an exponential pace. In reality, however, populations cannot increase indefinitely. In other words, at some point, the environment is going to put a limit to how many individuals of that species the population can actually have. So the environment is going to put a cap, so to speak, on that population. So in this chart here, we also see that we see the exponential growth model here, but that's not realistic. Instead, at some point, the environment says, okay, I've had enough, I can't handle any more individuals, and the level of the population starts leveling off. What would cause that leveling off? Usually it's a limitation of resources such as food or breeding space, or in some cases it could be something like increased predation. Whatever the cap is, the environmental cap is, we call that the carrying capacity, and it is mathematically denoted by the uppercase letter K. So we say the environment cannot carry anymore. It has reached capacity for that particular species. Interestingly enough, we can't really predict what the carrying capacity for any given species will be. Instead, we have to look at population data, long-term population data, and try to determine it empirically. That means we look at data and we make an inference rather than predict something ahead of time. So we're going to take a look at 2 examples here. The first being actual fur seals, and we can see in the graph here that between 1915 the population was low. We see some of that exponential growth here and then the leveling off. So it's pretty obvious that for breeding male fur seals, the carrying capacity, which was reached somewhere around 1935 in this particular environment, is around 10,000 individuals, because we don't see anything sustained beyond that that is going to show a sustained higher number. Unfortunately, K is not always easy to determine like that. If we look at the song sparrow population that's shown on the right-hand side, we notice that over time we see just a huge number of fluctuations, and those fluctuations, at least the decreases, are the result of actual catastrophic winters, and then the following years you see some rebounding and then another catastrophic event and rebounding, etc. So if someone were to ask you, what is the carrying capacity for the song sparrow population, it might be tempting to just go to the highest data point and say, well, it's probably around 70, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be sustainable. Instead, where we see a sustainable number is probably closer to somewhere in the 40 to 50 range here, because anytime you go really above that, you're going to see a big drop off. So K is determined empirically and not always easily. So what are some of the other features of carrying capacities? First and foremost, it's important to note that K is not a static number. In other words, it changes. Most interestingly, it will change, will increase or decrease with availability of resources, predation pressure, or sometimes other environmental factors such as disturbances. So if you increase the available resources to a particular population, then K should go up as well. Likewise, if you decrease the available resources, then K should decrease. So for example, when we look at a lot of marine mammals, we have a historical carrying capacity and we have a current one. The current carrying capacity is usually considerably lower than the historical one, in part because humans actually compete with the marine mammals for resources. This is usually in the form of food. For example, if you have fur seals that are out trying to eat a particular fish, and humans are also fishing that fish species, then we reduce the number of fish available for the fur seals, and therefore the environment can hold fewer fur seals simply because they don't have enough food. We compete with them. The same is true for breeding sites. Because humans really like coastline, we have taken over a lot of the breeding sites, and so there's fewer suitable breeding sites, which means there's a lower carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a very important statistic when we're looking at conservation. So we're going to actually examine that in a little bit more detail in future lectures. But understand that it's important to know what the carrying capacity of the environment is when you are trying to manage a particular marine mammal species. So with that, we're actually going to switch gears a little bit and take a look at another aspect of population structure. These are called life history traits. Life history traits look at something like your reproductive schedule and the survivorship of offspring in individuals. So in this graph here, we're going to note that there are several different reproductive schedules that are diagrammed here, but I'm really only interested in group 1 and group 3. So in group 1, what this is showing is that most individuals survive for a very long time before dying off. The line here for number 1 would be very similar to a human population. Group 3, on the other hand, shows that almost all newborns die very, very young. Only a few make it to old age, etc. Those are two completely different reproductive schedules. Group 3 would be more reminiscent of an insect that might produce thousands of offspring, but only 4 or 5 of them actually make it to adulthood. So group 1 is usually represented by long lifespans, few reproductive events, but again, very good survivorship of the young. And group 3 is a completely opposite strategy where you just proliferate as much as you possibly can, make as many offspring as you can, and understand that almost all of them are going to die, but a few will make it. We call these changes or these differences K versus R selection in life history traits. The R selection is going to be like group 3 and the K selection is going to be group 1. So what we're going to do is take a look at some of the differences between K and R selection in different respects. So for what each female does, in an R-selected species, they're going to produce large numbers of offspring, hundreds or thousands of offspring. A K-selected species will only produce a few offspring during their lifetime. So obviously you're getting the idea that humans are going to be labeled as a K-selected species. What about parental investment? In an R-selected species, there's really none. You're so interested in just getting the offspring out there that you don't have time to care for them. In a K-selected species, each offspring gets a lot of care, and that of course contributes to their high survival rate that we see per individual offspring. So what about lifespan? Our selected species tend to have a short lifespan. They also have a short amount of time before they're reproductively ready, simply because they don't live very long, so they better be reproductive pretty quickly or they're going to lose out on that window of time, where K-selected species tend to have a longer lifespan, and usually it's years before they're reproductively active. This again is going to have some conservation implications because in an R-selected species, if you have some type of catastrophic event, the R-selected species has the ability to rebound really quickly. But unfortunately, a K-selected species does not. It can take years and years, usually on the decades, rarely on the millennia, but usually on the decade level before they rebound from a catastrophic event. Unfortunately, all marine mammals are K-selected species, and what this means is that when we're looking at conservation, we have to take into account some of these traits on their reproductive schedule. So again, what does this actually mean for managing marine mammals? It means that because they are K-selected species, these populations increase very slowly. And that's because each female can usually only produce one offspring every year, sometimes every 2 years, and sometimes every 3 years. And so that means we're going to have a very slow recovery if we do anything drastic to this population, such as reduce it dramatically due to a whaling effort, for example. This also means that from an evolutionary standpoint, it happens on a much longer time scale, which is not good because our Earth is rapidly changing due to human presence. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at 2 real quick examples. We're going to look at sea otters and orcas and talk about the sea otter population in Alaska. This is an example of why it can be difficult to manage a K-selected species. Now, sea otters, as we learned in a previous lecture, are keystone species. They ensure the vitality and biodiversity of the kelp forest by eating the urchins, which are kelp predators. So because when the sea otters are there, the kelp forests are very rich in biodiversity and very healthy. And like all marine mammal species, sea otters, of course, are going to be K-selected. Now, off the Aleutian Islands, the sea otter populations numbered over 50,000 in 1990, and just 10 years later, they were reduced to 20% or lower. Estimates were anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000. So what happened? What happened to these sea otters? We weren't fishing them, we weren't harvesting them. What actually happened? Well, this problem was actually addressed by 2 researchers, Tim Tinker and Jim Estes of UC Santa Cruz, and in 1991 they actually observed an orca preying on an otter. Now, otters are not the normal food for orcas. In fact, you might think of it almost like orca popcorn because otters are small. So one orca would have to eat 6 otters a day in order to sustain their caloric need. But they started observing more and more of these events, and what they realized is that the disappearance of the otters was almost certainly due and pretty much exclusively due to the orca predation, which seemed to be kind of a rapid shift, like they had learned how to do this. A couple of them had learned how to do this, and then they went ahead and just kept doing it. So that, of course, brought up the question, why on earth were orcas suddenly deciding to prey on food items that weren't very nutritious for them? Well, remember, a transient orca's normal prey is going to be a baleen whale calf or a blubber-rich seal. And both of those have also dropped dramatically. Now, why? Well, the whaling industry decimated our whale populations back in the 17 and 1800s and even the early 1900s, so we don't have as many of those as we need, and again, slow recovery time for K-selected species. The other issue is that for the seals, which again are going to be nutritious, humans compete with the seals for their food. And because of our fishing efforts in the waters, the number of seals had decreased a lot as well. The orcas had nowhere left to turn, but they said, well, sea otters are better than nothing, and they decimated the sea otter population as a result. So that gives you a summary of K-selected species and their conservation implications. And with that, I will see you next time.